Today I want to talk about how important drawing is to the painting process. Even before we put a brush to canvas or mix any color, drawing is what simplifies our subject and makes it easier to paint. Today we're talking about the importance of drawing in the process of creating a painting. And I don't mean the drawing that we're doing while we paint. We're always drawing while we paint. And by drawing, I mean getting the right shapes, getting the shapes the right proportion, putting them in the right place. All that is drawing. We typically think of drawing as maybe lines, filling in lines with values. Not so with painting. Painting's more about big shapes and big masses, getting the right proportion, the right shape. What I'm wanting to focus on today is more the process, the painting process, or the beginning stage, where we use drawing to kind of work out problems, compose the painting, simplify the subject so it's not filled with so much detail. And I have several images here and the kind of drawing process I went through before the painting. This one's in Yosemite. A lot going on here. You can see all the detail in the trees on the left side, the detail in the mountains on the right side, the stuff in the foreground, the fence, the stump. There's a lot there that I just don't need in the painting. So the drawing helps me figure out what I want in the painting and what I can leave out. And I'm typically looking at big shapes and masses, 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 big shapes, and then simplifying them. When I look at this, what's important is shape of the sky, shape of the two mountains in the background, shape of the middle ground trees, background trees, and the shape of the water. And that's my big shapes and masses that I want to work with. So I have to figure out a way before I start painting and messing up a canvas with a lot of paint. I need to figure out where I'm placing those big masses, proportion-wise, shape-wise, and also value-wise, how I want the big values to work as well. Because not only am I simplifying shape, I'm trying to simplify the values. And if I can reduce everything to 3 to 4 values, or maybe 2 to 3 to 4 values, one of those will simplify what I'm looking at. Because there's way too many values, way too many little value changes in little areas. And I want to get rid of all the little stuff and make everything bigger. Again, 4 to 8 big shapes, 3 to 4 values, and that's going to make the painting a lot easier. So I typically do 2 to 3 thumbnail drawings before a painting, and I'm talking about studio painting. I usually do drawings also outside before I do a painting. Again, just to simplify my subject and kind of figure out proportion and shape and getting rid of detail. Outside, I tend to do just one and get right to the painting because I'm losing my light quickly. Inside, it's a little different. I'll spend a lot of time doing a lot of different drawings. This is one of the drawings for that scene. You can see I got rid of the stuff in the foreground, the stump, the fence, a little bit of the foreground before you get to the water, then the shape of the water, shape of the ground, shape of the trees, and then the two shapes of the mountains and the shape of the sky. So big, simple shapes, reducing a lot of the individual trees and creating more a mass of trees instead of individual. And this has been smeared a little bit, so you lose kind of the simplicity of the values. But I found one shadow pattern first, and then one light, and the light is the light of the value of the paper. And then I added darker values into the shadow. So I have 2 shadow values and 1 light value, and that's my 3 values. Forcing everything from this into the shapes, everything has to be one of those 3 values, and the simplified shapes makes it a lot easier to paint. Now here's I haven't done this larger yet. This is a small color study. Doing a couple of these, trying some different colors. This is just the standard primary palette, red, yellow, blue with green, violet, and orange. So primary, secondary colors. And again, using the drawing at first to simplify the drawing on the canvas, or the board in this case, and then the simplified palette just to figure out those big shapes and big areas. So this one's still in process here. This is another one from Yosemite. This one's a little different. I'm using, again, it's studio painting. I'm using 2 photographs now to compose this. I don't do that a lot, but once in a while I do. I like this image. I like the shadow in the foreground, the sunlight kind of in the middle ground, and the trees being hit by sunlight, and then mostly shadow in the background. That works really well value-wise and big shape-wise. But I wanted to get rid of these aspen trees, or yeah, I think they're aspens or small cottonwoods. I'm not sure which. Get rid of them, and I'm going to add the foreground of this creek in here, and then some of the pine trees. So again, I did several thumbnail drawings. This is a shape that corresponds to 24 by 30. I tried one square, like a 5 by 5 inch drawing for a 24 by 24 painting, or 30 by 30 painting in square format. I also tried a longer horizontal, which did not work out very well. I think the more square or rectangle worked better. Square would have worked well also, but I went with this. And here I've placement of the creek, and I'm using the light here in the foreground also. So the creek is a dark shape, or the bank on the right side is a dark with dappled light or shadow and sunlight on the left side. And the drawings don't have to be detailed, or they really shouldn't be detailed. The minute you get too detailed with the drawings, you end up with a finished drawing, which is fine. Nothing wrong with doing finished drawings. But the purpose of these drawings is strictly to work out the shapes, the shadow pattern, the proportions, simplify the values, and simplify the shapes. And I'm using kind of the background here, these background trees with a few of these aspens pushed further back. And I did several of these drawings, had some of these darker trees, which are in shadow, kind of in the background. Had them bigger, had them a little smaller. This is what I went with a little sunlit aspens in the background. So working out those shapes, the placement of them, and the contrast. The contrast is really important because there's a lot of strong dark and light. And the more I can set up those dark and light shapes next to each other and create that contrast, the more interesting the painting is going to be. Working out the light and dark shapes of the background mountains too. Now here's the painting that finished 24 by 30. You can see the mid-ground dark trees against the background light trees, and then the dappled light in the front foreground. Spending most of the time on the focal point, which is the mountain, getting the subtle color changes, but the drawing really sets up the shape of the light on the mountain, the shape of the shadow, and that's what I'm using. Obviously, it's not detailed, it's not overly finished, but this is enough to go by to set up my painting. Then I can refine those shapes in the painting as well. And it doesn't hurt sometimes to do maybe a bit more finished drawing in the studio to kind of work out the shapes and the proportions. Just make sure as you get more finished in your drawing, you're not gearing it towards detail. It should still be geared towards simplicity. Because that's the whole point, I think, of these drawings. You can call them thumbnail drawings because that's pretty much what they are. They aren't very big, maybe 4 by 5, 3 by 6, whatever the shape happens to be. But small, and I tend to spend maybe 15 minutes on each one, sometimes more, sometimes less. Here's one in the Salt River Canyon in Arizona. This is early morning, so a lot of nice shadows. Midday at places like this in the desert, it just goes flat. But early morning, late afternoon is when it really opens up with all the shapes and value changes that makes a real nice painting. And here, this is also studio. I did several drawings. Tried a longer horizontal because I thought the expanse of the shadow pattern here from right to left would be for a really longer horizontal painting. But I didn't like those as much, so I ended up not a square, but smaller horizontal rectangle. Not quite as long, but not quite square. Finding that shadow pattern. And again, some drawings almost look abstract and you can't tell much about them. But for me, this is planning. Planning the shapes, placement of, in this case, I got a figure and 2 horses, the lights of the trees, the shadow pattern. And I'm not looking for different values in this one. It's pretty much just 2 values, the light of the paper and then the shadow of the pencil. Really not any in between. I do have a darker dark around on the horses, but that's just so they stand out a bit more. I did 4 or 5 of these to try and figure out what I want the painting to look like in the end, shape-wise, proportion-wise, simplified shadow-wise, and that really helps. And this is a smaller, kind of a color study. I'd like to do this bigger. Ended up a little bit wider than my drawing. Same sense of simplifying the values. And here I'm just working out the color in those big shapes and big values that I get in the drawing. And then the bigger one, I'll be more careful with the drawing on the horses and the figure. These color studies and the thumbnail drawings kind of work out the problems ahead of time so you're not in mid-painting on a larger canvas and you start running into difficulties. I mean, you still run into difficulties, but you get rid of a lot of them when you plan through the thumbnail drawings. Now, for something completely different, I went to the Metropolitan Museum a couple of years ago to see a show on Jacques-Louis David, I think that's how you pronounce it, French painter in the neoclassical painting, which is 18th, 19th century. And they had an exhibition of his paintings, but also along with the paintings were his drawings and how he prepared for these paintings. And it was a really great show. They also had a Homer exhibit there, which is what I really came to see Winslow Homer's exhibit. But this was really, really good. This is his painting. I think it's Socrates drinking poison for whatever reason. But anyway, it was interesting how he planned for this painting. Almost like an illustrator in the 20th century, planning out a composition first, planning out figures where they're going to be, how they're going to pose, then hiring models and doing studies from them, and then the final painting. So it was quite the process. There were several of these. Some of the drawings were just pencil. You can see he started with pencil, real lightly planning out the architecture, the setting, and the figures, because the figures are done in pencil first, lightly, and you can see where he's changed his mind on the position of the figures, then taking the pen and ink and outlining the figures so they're more definite, more solid, and fairly detailed, because he's not using photographs, obviously. And I saw a lot of smaller drawings where he's trying to figure out the background, the architecture, how many figures that were very loose. This is more mid-planning, where he's got the figures and he's kind of worked out how he wants them to pose. And just beautiful ink line on these figures. Really nice. I like his drawings a lot more than his paintings. His paintings are great. I mean, very well done, but they don't have the spontaneity or the feel that the drawings do. Then, from this line drawing of just shape, working out the background, he does a value with pen and ink wash. So kind of the same thing. He's changed the background a little bit and is using 3 values. The white of the paper, kind of a light, 4 values. The white of the paper or the light paper, a little bit of a halftone, which is also in the light. So 2 lights and then 2 darks, a darker dark and a lighter dark. And forcing everything into those 4 values. So when you simplify your values in a thumbnail drawing, force everything into those 3 to 4 values. Or 2 if you just want to simplify it any more than that. And then from here, he's got kind of the position of the pose. He's got the figures outlined, or he's got the figures placed how he wants. This is the value, and then he goes to individual. So we're looking at this figure right here on the end. And here's kind of the study for that, the figure behind him. So he's doing more life-size now, or size of the figures in the original painting. And he has a grid where he's transposing the grid on the figures so that he can draw it on the canvas. Because he drew fairly finished drawing before he painted. But he's working out the folds and the closes. Great drawing. Again, a toned paper. So he's got the middle value in the paper this time instead of the light. Then he's adding 2 shadows, lighter shadow and a darker shadow. And then using the white chalk for the lights. So 4 values. When I say halftone, I'm talking about the slightly darker light. The halftone is on the light side, not the shadow side. So you got the light of the chalk halftone, which is still light, but not catching the light as much as the light does. And then 2 shadows, a darker shadow and a lighter shadow. And then there's the painting of that section on the finished painting. And you can see where the drawings help. Here's another one of the figures. Again, he has a grid so he can transfer the drawing proportionately correctly. But again, a toned paper, that's more the halftone, and the chalk is the light, and then a couple of shadows. Working that out fairly well, but his drawings were beautiful. A lot looser, a lot more feeling to them than the paintings. This was a lot of his sketchbooks that you could look at, and here was, I think these were from earlier days, maybe his study, where he would do value drawings. This was in Rome where he studied. Just a lot of little, 4 by 6 inch little pen and ink wash drawings, where again he's using 3 to 4 values to try and look at something and reduce it to simple values, showing the form and the light. Probably lightly drawing it in with pencil. Here's another one, a thumbnail where he's just trying to plan using graphite, just trying to plan what the figures are doing. Had a lot of those for this one. I'm sure he did for everyone. And then when he was satisfied, he went to the value using pen and ink to outline the figures a bit more, to make them more definite how they're going to look, and using the wash of, again, 3 to 4 values, forcing all the values into that. And then the painting, I didn't take a photograph of the painting. Should have. The drawings were nice though. You can see how the drawing really helps prepare for the painting. You work out all the problems because there's just no photography. Now we're going to go to Giovanni Tiepolo, a Venetian painter, 18th century, the Rococo period. And the Metropolitan has a lot of his. This is not one of his from the Metropolitan. This was a mural somewhere in Europe, but they had a lot of his large paintings. And by large, I mean the figures were bigger than life size. Drawings he did for these were really interesting as well, because he worked things out, worked out the perspective of the figures, the drawings of the different stuff. His paintings are very interesting, the animals, all the things involved, but they were really simplified versions of what he wanted to paint. He really simplified things really well, while still showing enough detail to make it interesting. Here's another one of his paintings. You can see the simplicity in the painting. There's not a lot of overt detail here. It's just only what's necessary. The simplified darks and lights really make it work. Of that period, I probably find his paintings the most interesting. Plus, his compositions are so well done. I never cared for the floating head angels in these paintings, but aside from that, very nice. Now, his drawings, he used almost all that I've seen are pen and ink wash drawings. Some of them I could see a little pencil, light pencil outline, so I might lightly fill in the shape. But what he's looking for is what sets up the whole painting, is the shadow pattern. I mean, this gives you the whole painting right away in big, simple, dark and light shapes. So this is just two values, an early no-tan from the day. So you can see detail is not what carries the painting. It's the big masses of dark and light. Of course, he could probably draw the figure without having a model, but this allows him to set up his composition, where the placement of the model, getting the right proportions, and then maybe hiring the model and doing drawings and color studies from. This is not a great image. It's kind of a small file, but you can see, again, the dark pattern, how that sets up the action, sets up the placement. So it's not a matter of outlining the figure first to get the figure right. It's those big masses of dark and light. Then use outline to kind of refine the drawing. We always want to go to outline first, but see mass and shape first. Now, I don't know that he did this, but my guess is washing in the light shadow pattern first, then using the outline to refine the drawing, or a little bit of both as he goes along. But it's more about the mass than it is about the outline. Here's one where he's using, again, not a big file, but using a toned paper where he has the 2 shadows, a little bit darker shadow, lighter shadow, then the half tone of the paper, and then the white with a little bit of Chinese white or some kind of opaque white watercolor. And here he's placing his lightest lights and his darkest darks, so that your eye is going to go, to this figure first, and then some of the other lighter figures. Everything else sits back because it's darker. The lights aren't as light. So he's planning out placement of the big values. Same thing here, kind of a toned paper with 2 values of shadow, then the toned paper, and then the white ink or Chinese white watercolor. But it's all about the pattern and simplifying. I mean, you could do a painting from this, just work out a color palette and and go to work. Same thing here, big simple shapes and values, a little bit of outline. And I don't know if he did bigger drawings from this, more finished drawings to paint from or not. These certainly help him set things up. Now we're going to an artist, British artist, Edward Compton, in the 19th century. Here you have photography available, and I'm sure he used some photography to some degree, because even at this point, cameras were not that good to work from, and they were a hassle if you're climbing around in the Alps like he did a lot. But the drawings here I found really interesting, really loose drawing style. Again, simplified values, 3 values. In this case, one light and a darker dark and a lighter dark. And then some outline to show the shape, because this is what he's using along with a color study to do bigger paintings back at the studio. But had a great sense of line on there. It had a nice flow to it. Seeing the proportions right is what's important. It's not tight, careful. Well, it is careful, but it's not tight drawing, worrying about straight lines and all the detail. It's big, simple masses and shapes. Being able to see the whole instead of small details makes this drawing a lot more accurate. We tend to zoom in and focus in on small stuff that doesn't matter. Here he's using, a heavier drawing paper, doing the drawing, and then adding a little watercolor. Some opaque watercolor and transparent watercolor. Not much. You can see the shadow pattern, a little bit of outline. The outline is important to get the outside edge of the shapes, but it's the mass and the proportions of the mass or of the shapes that really, really helps or really matters. There's enough detail on the tower and the building to do an accurate painting from this, and a little quick color study along with it. Here's another one where he's smearing the values a little bit. Pretty much a no-tan, just one value for darks, one value for the light, and kind of working out the composition. Here he's using a toned paper, like some of the other drawings the other artists use, and a little bit of Chinese white, some kind of opaque white watercolor, and then washes of shadow. So 3 to 4 values, but working out where thing placement is. It's a lot of stuff going on here, but it's very simplified compared to what he was looking at. It's kind of a inside look and to see how important drawing is to painting before you even start painting. I mean, during the painting, we're always drawing, even though we're using the brush and thinking color. Drawing is always there because drawing is about shape and proportion, and doing that ahead of time is really helpful also.